thank you all for joining us today. I know some people are still trickling in, but it's the top of the hour, so it's a good time to get started. Thank you for coming to our webinar, Environmental Chemicals and Breast Cancer, What Do We Know? What Can We Do? Featuring guest speaker, Dr. Julia Brody. My name is Nora Barnett. I'm the Health Professions Outreach Specialist for the network of the National Library of Medicine, Region 6. Some information to cover before we get started. All attendees have been muted to reduce background noise, but we do appreciate your comments and questions. So please use the chat box to share your comments and the Q&A to submit any questions you have for our speaker. My colleague Miles Diaz-Castel is providing technical assistance today, and he'll be keeping an eye on the chat and the Q&A with me. We'll queue up your questions and save them for the end of the presentation. Speaking of which, when you do post questions and comments, please select everyone from the drop-down menu so that we can all see them. Closed captioning is enabled, and it's available by clicking on the icon with the 3 dots and selecting closed caption. We're recording today's session and we'll post it on NNLM's YouTube channel within a couple of weeks. At that time, everyone who registers to the webinar will get an email with a link to the recording, so keep an eye out for that. This class is eligible for 1 Medical Library Association continuing education credit, 1 Consumer Health Information Specialist credit, and 1 Certified Health Education or CHES continuing education contact hour. You'll be able to claim your credit at the end by filling out the evaluation link that we provide. And speaking of that evaluation, please take a moment to complete that at the end so that we can hear your feedback. This webinar is brought to you by the network of the National Library of Medicine. For those of you not familiar with NNLM, you may have heard of the National Institutes of Health, the nation's leading research agency. The National Library of Medicine is one of the 27 institutes and offices of the NIH. It's the world's largest biomedical library and produces online resources such as PubMed and Medline Plus. NNLM, or the Network of the National Library of Medicine, is an outreach program of NLM. It's made up of 7 regional medical libraries, 3 national offices, and 4 national centers, all providing training, funding, and engagement opportunities. Today's session was organized by Region 6 as part of our Speaker Spotlight series. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Julia Brody. Dr. Brody is a nationally recognized expert on environmental chemicals and breast cancer, as well as a leader in community-based research and public engagement in science. Recently, she was part of a team that used EPA data to identify 900 chemicals, many of them in consumer products and the environment, that have characteristics linked to breast cancer. In addition, she is the author of several comprehensive reviews of epidemiological studies on environmental chemicals and breast cancer. Her current research focuses on communicating with people about their own chemical exposures and strategies to reduce exposure through individual choices and as community members and voters. She is also studying what Americans know about endocrine disruptors as part of the emerging field of environmental health literacy. Her research includes studies across the U.S. in Massachusetts, California, Puerto Rico, and elsewhere, supported by the National Institutes of Health, the California Breast Cancer Research Program, and the National Science Foundation. Dr. Brody joined Silent Spring Institute as executive director in 1996, shortly after its founding, and led the organization for 28 years, transforming Silent Spring into a leading scientific authority on environmental chemicals and women's health. So with that, I'm going to turn off my camera and hand it over to Dr. Brody.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take a moment to share some slides, hopefully with no tech troubles. Can you see the slides okay? I'm not hearing any objections, so I'm going to carry on. And thank you very much.
We can.
Thank you very much for the invitation to be with you today. I'm really delighted to be here because you all are in the thick of helping people navigate information and about science and health and sort out misinformation and disinformation, which is all around us, including on topics like breast cancer, which we would think would be more neutral. So you've probably heard media stories that marginalize concerns about chemicals in cancer using language like there's no proof that such and such causes breast cancer. Or you may have heard this from a doctor or a relative who's skeptical of your questions and concerns. For example, last fall, the public radio host Meghna Chakrabarty asked one of her guests, but can we say definitively at all that we should be looking to environmental chemical exposures as a potential cause of earlier cancers? And I want to focus on why that's not really the question that we should be asking, and reframe that discussion to ask instead, what do we know about common chemical exposures and cancers? Are there safer choices for our families? And how can science guide prevention? So I want to talk about how these no proof messages are contrary to the modern understanding of the biology of cancer, and offer an alternative framework for using the knowledge that we do have. This is really a quite urgent public health problem because breast cancer is now the most common invasive cancer worldwide in the US and the leading cause of cancer deaths. Incidence is rising in the US for younger women, those diagnosed under 50 years of age, and particularly for women in their 30s and Asian American women. Strikingly, that for cancers diagnosed before age 50 in the US, breast cancer is 6 times more common than any cancer in men. So to focus on prevention, I want to talk first about what we know now about environmental chemicals and cancer, offer some resources to help people reduce harmful exposures, talk about how to spot misleading information, including from sources you expect to be reliable, and then dip into some very new science about chemicals that increase the body's production of estrogen and progesterone, which are hormones that are known to be related to breast cancer risk. So starting with what we know now, we know that most breast cancer is not just due to inherited genes. This graph is from a study of twins in Northern Europe and estimated that about 1/3 of breast cancer risk is due to inherited genes, including genes we haven't identified yet. Only 5 or 10% of breast cancers are associated with the high risk BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes. And even among women who have higher genetic risk, there appear to be environmental influences. Not everyone with the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes gets breast cancer. And we see differences in the age at diagnosis associated with some environmental exposures. Second, we know that breast cancer is influenced at many stages of life. These are called windows of susceptibility, including before birth, during puberty, during a first full-term pregnancy, and at menopause. These are times when the breast is changing. And because of that, it's more susceptible to carcinogenesis. And third, we know that there are many biological pathways to cancer. The International Agency for Research on Cancer has called these the key characteristics of human carcinogens, and they represent multiple interacting biological pathways. For breast cancer, for example, we are interested in the potential for chemicals to alter breast development in ways that make the breast more susceptible to carcinogens throughout the life cycle. A well-established example of this is the pharmaceutical DES, It was given to women in pregnancy in hopes that it would reduce miscarriage. It was not successful at that. And we learned later on, unfortunately, that both the moms and the daughters had higher breast cancer risk later in life. A second established biological pathway is chemicals that mimic hormones, particularly estrogen. And a well-established example of that is combination estrogen, progesterone, hormone replacement therapy. We can see in lab studies that estrogen makes breast cancer cells grow. And so that's a very important process for cancer development. Third are classic carcinogens. These are chemicals that damage DNA. And an established example of that for breast cancer is ionizing radiation, particularly when the exposure is earlier in life. And we do know that in the US, you don't have to test chemicals for safety before you put them into products. And as a result of that, it's not surprising that exposures to chemicals that have these kinds of biological activity are very common. For example, chemicals that are considered breast carcinogens because they cause mammary gland tumors in animals are found in gasoline, in auto exhaust, and air pollution, some paint removers and solvents, some flame retardants, some pesticides, and water disinfection byproducts. So in addition, endocrine disrupting chemicals, for example, estrogen mimics, are common in cleaners, personal care products, fragrances, chemical sunscreens, and plastics. And at this point, we've all become familiar with some of the crazy names of these chemicals like bisphenols, BPA, BPS, BPF, phthalates, oxybenzone, benzophenone 3, those are sunscreen chemicals. Parabens are used in personal care products as preservatives sometimes. And PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. These are non-stick and stain-resistant chemicals, and they've become very common drinking water contaminants in the US. We also know that not everyone is equally exposed. This example is from the Centers for Disease Control National Exposure Report, showing that Black women have higher levels of the weak estrogen methylparaben compared with other women. Silent Spring Institute did some research where we tested products hair products that are used by Black women, and found these estrogenic chemicals are more commonly found in these products than in other products. So it may be that products marketed to Black women are contributing to this exposure disparity and potentially to health disparities related to these chemicals. These exposures may actually be more consequential than we think. I was struck last year by a lot of news media coverage about younger women having more trouble breastfeeding than in the past. And I was struck by this because we see in animal studies that some of these endocrine disruptors impair milk production. This is an experimental results for BPS, one of the bisphenol relatives of BPA. And you can see that milk production is significantly impaired in the BPS exposed animals. And we have some evidence from humans as well in studies showing that higher exposures to PFAS are affecting women's ability to breastfeed. But these chemicals are extremely difficult to study in humans because it's hard to match the study design to what we know about breast cancer biology. So you can appreciate this from what I've told you about what we do know about breast cancer. The early life influences and the long gap between exposure and diagnosis means that an epidemiological study to be relevant to breast cancer biology needs to have an understanding of exposures that occurred early in life and over many decades. And that's extremely difficult to achieve because these exposures typically can't be self-reported. We don't know what's in our air pollution or even what's in our consumer products because they're inadequately labeled. The formulations are changing all the time. And we're changing products and using multiple products, resulting in complex mixtures. And in addition, for many of the relevant exposures, we don't have an unexposed comparison group because these chemicals are ubiquitous. So what this means is that the characteristics of breast cancer don't make it easy to study. And indeed, most of what we know about the causes of breast cancer are things that people can tell you themselves, like how old they were when they got their first period or how old they were when their first child was born. And that has been a challenge to match that kind of information for environmental chemicals. And that's why I want to tell you about this one particular amazing study, which offers a proof of principle by offering a one-of-a-kind assessment of early life chemical exposures in breast cancer. This study began in the 1950s and 60s and recruited women who were giving birth at the Kaiser Hospital in Oakland, California, and collected blood samples and enrolled not just the moms, but also their children, and now also their grandchildren. And as the women and daughters became old enough to be diagnosed with breast cancer, the study found higher breast cancer risk associated with high DDT exposure early in life. So this is a really critical proof of principle that environmental chemicals may be acting in the same way that we've seen for the pharmaceutical DES. Nora mentioned that I did a major review of epidemiological studies of environmental chemicals in breast cancer that was published in 2018. And only 11% of those studies had information about exposures during these windows of susceptibility. So we really have a knowledge gap here. Here's another important proof of principle study. This is the Long Island Breast Cancer Study Project, which measured PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. These are in air pollution and tobacco smoke and grilled and smoked food. And the study found that among women who had higher exposures to PAHs and genes for poor DNA repair, they found higher breast cancer risk. So this means that they were exposed to an environmental source that damaged their cells, but they didn't have the capacity to effectively repair them. So this is an important example of the idea that genes and environment can interact to produce cancers. Okay, so that's my quick review for you of what we do know about environmental chemicals in cancer. And you're now ready to outscore most Americans on these crucial misconceptions. So most Americans believe that more than half your cancer risk is inherited in your genes, and you know that is not correct. And 80% of Americans think that chemicals have to pass many safety tests before they can be used in products in the US. And unfortunately, that is not true either. These two falsehoods, I think, are really important for us to address because they suggest that there's nothing we can do. And when you understand that most cancer risk is not genetic and that we could be changing our safety tests to protect ourselves better, then we can move forward to do something about the high cancer incidence that we're facing. So what evidence do we have about exposure reduction, and what kinds of resources are there out there to help people? First, I want to talk about the framework for using this information. And this again gets back to the idea that looking for proof is not the right way to think about breast cancer prevention. The Institute of Medicine report on breast cancer and the environment says this: it may be prudent to avoid or minimize exposure because the available evidence suggests biological plausibility for exposure to be associated with an increased risk of breast cancer, or there is suggestive evidence from epidemiology, or both. And the President's Cancer Panel has a similar kind of statement that says an environmental health paradigm for long latency diseases is needed to enable regulatory action based on compelling animal and in vitro evidence before cause and effect in humans has been proven. Remember, we don't do experiments in people to expose them to hazardous chemicals and see what happens. So that means that we're not going to have the kind of proof that would be definitive. And that's similarly, the International Agency for Research on Cancer uses animal and mechanistic cell evidence from laboratory studies to classify chemicals as carcinogenic when there isn't human evidence. So to summarize this conceptual framework, this is a graph from my testimony at the President's Cancer Panel. And the concept here is that if you have biological evidence that a chemical is activating a pathway to cancer, that is, it is a hormone disruptor, it mimics estrogen, or it stimulates estrogen production, or it damages, or it causes mammary gland tumors in animals. If you have that kind of biological evidence and you know that people are widely exposed to this chemical, you have a basis to take action and begin to reduce exposures based on that strength of evidence. So what this means when you think about those chemicals that are relevant to breast cancer is that we need a new way to talk about cancer prevention that thinks about a whole continuum of actions, from individual consumer choices to purchasing decisions, for example, by libraries to not use pesticides indoors or to use cleaning products that are fragrance-free, decisions by retailers and manufacturers about what is for sale. And of course, regulations can protect us from air pollutants, drinking water pollutants, and change the rules for what goes into consumer products. And new thinking about regulatory frameworks to address the thousands of chemicals that are on the market are exploring class-based approaches where we'll regulate a whole family of chemicals at once, so you don't end up banning one and then getting a substitute that's structurally very similar and equally risky. Here's an example of how this can work. So Silent Spring Institute was the first to really start studying exposures to endocrine disruptors in US homes. And one of the things we found in our early research was that there were very high levels of flame retardants in homes in California. That turned out to be because of a specific flammability standard there that was leading leading manufacturers to put large quantities of flame retardants into furniture foam and other types of products. When we published these results, advocates in California and news media coverage by the Chicago Tribune brought a lot of attention to this. And the governor changed the flammability standard so that it's now possible to buy a couch without these toxic chemicals, not just in California, but also throughout the US, because California is such a large market that when it changes its rules, everyone benefits. And the really good news is that the older California standard was not actually protecting against the risky types of fires. So we're able to eliminate these toxic chemicals without sacrificing fire safety. And more good news, when we went back to test homes after furniture was replaced with furniture that met the newer standards, we did actually observe lower levels of flame retardants in the household dust. Here's another fun example from our research. You can reduce your body burden of BPA and DEHP, a phthalate that's in food packaging, by more than half in just 3 days by eating fresh foods. That is, foods that are not packaged in plastic or processed in plastics. That's a little bit easier said than done. So it's important for higher level actions to reduce the presence of these chemicals in food contact materials. But you can see that actions that any family can take will reduce your body burden in these chemicals. Here's another example. In this study, people were asked about their use of makeup and also whether they were reading the labels before they bought a product to see whether it contained parabens. So the orange dots are makeup users who are not reading the labels. The gray dots are women who didn't use makeup. And the purple dots are people who used makeup but read the labels and avoided products with parabens. And you can see that their body burden is more similar to the gray dots, the non-users, than to the orange dots who were not reading the labels. You can also see that there's a spread of exposures. So even the label readers were not able to completely avoid their exposure to these chemicals, although they were able to reduce it somewhat. Nicholas Kristof, the journalist, participated in this study and wrote about it in the New York Times. So to get more tips like these, Silent Spring Institute created the smartphone app Detox Me that represents our knowledge about ways to reduce your exposure to endocrine disrupting compounds. It's available for Apple and Android phones and also on the web, and it's in English and Spanish. And it offers simple everyday tips in various categories of life. And there's also, you can also go straight to the top 10 tips rather than scrolling through individual tips. For example, some of the easy choices to reduce your exposures are to dump air fresheners, use fragrance-free products, eliminate mothballs. And there are a couple hundred of these tips to try. We also really like Clearia, which is a Chrome extension and smartphone app that's helpful for online shopping. It will essentially read the label for you and tell you if there are any ingredients that are on the common red lists. For concerns about PFAS, I recommend the PFAS Exchange. It includes fact sheets about exposure reduction for people in communities that have been affected by PFAS contamination. You can enter blood or water, personal blood or water results and see comparison data and comparisons to the guidelines. EPA just issued new drinking water standards, I think last week or the week before, that are going to be really important in helping to reduce exposures to these chemicals. And the National Academies issued guidance for medical monitoring for exposed patients. And you can access all of this information on the PFAS Exchange. It also has a quick quiz that people have been enjoying, and maps of affected communities and community organizations so people can connect with each other across the country. I also highly recommend the film Unacceptable Risk, which talks about Dr. Margaret Kripke's experience on the President's Cancer Panel. I showed you a statement that came out of their report She is a prominent cancer researcher, but hadn't been an expert on environmental chemicals. And this talks about her learning process about the assumptions that chemicals were safety tested and then learning that they're not. And for medical professionals, I recommend this 3-part series for clinicians that updates them about these modern conceptions of multiple pathways to cancer and talks about how to share this information with patients and the public. Nora mentioned that my own research has been focused on talking to individuals about their own chemical exposures. And I find that when we share this knowledge, everyone realizes that they can play a role in cancer prevention by voting, simply by telling family, friends, and coworkers and neighbors about something that they've learned, and that leaders will emerge to take action in their communities. One of my favorite examples is in our study of San Francisco women firefighters. We had enrolled a group of office workers as the comparison group to the firefighters. The firefighters, of course, when they saw their results, they changed some practices at the fire stations to reduce their own exposures. But the office workers also went to their managers and asked for flame retardant-free furniture in the next purchasing round. So changes like that can happen as people learn about the opportunities. So now I want to turn to talking about some of the misleading information that's out there, including from sources that you expect to be reliable. And back to this question of messages that marginalize concern. Well, think about what's happening here. Of course, we expect that industry is going to claim lack of scientific evidence about the chemicals that they're producing and using. They're going to oppose regulation. They're pulling out the tobacco playbook again and again to manufacture doubt and diminish concerns about chemical exposures. But what's interesting in this systems analysis by Dr. Polly Hoppin, which I found really eye-opening, is that she notes how scientists and health professionals are actually playing into the industry narrative. Scientific norms seek certainty in conclusions about risks, and some scientists and health professionals are therefore reinforcing a dominant narrative that environmental risks are a small problem or that there's no proof. I think quite often these communications are well-intentioned, that people don't want to be scary. They don't want to scare people. And with that in mind, I want to go back to my own research about telling people about their own chemical exposures and note that we have found that people do not become overly alarmed by this information. In fact, they're grateful for it. They appreciate it. And they quickly start brainstorming about actions that they can take to reduce their exposures. The consequence of these false reassuring messages is that people become confused. They think health problems are inevitable. Regulation remains weak. And going around this circle, chemicals policy continues to not require testing. And then we have little investment in understanding health impacts. We have limited data, and that feeds back into the industry claims that we don't have any evidence. So I think it's really important for scientists, health professionals, and other experts to think carefully about being more transparent, more straightforward, and more complete about what we're saying to the public. Here's an example of what I would consider to be false reassurance coming from the National Cancer Institute website, which says, even if a chemical is shown in a laboratory test to cause cancer, this does not necessarily mean it will cause cancer in people exposed to that chemical in the environment. This is true, but it's misleading. And the next sentence should say, often chemicals that cause cancer in lab tests also cause cancer in people. US EPA and the Food and Drug Administration use this information to make decisions to keep us safe. Here's another example from the National Cancer Institute. Individual chemicals are likely to cause only a small increase in risk. This may or may not be true, but in any case, the next sentences should say, but we're exposed to many chemicals every day, and the risks can add up. Also, when exposures are common in a large population, small risks lead to many people getting sick. So back to the question about whether it's true or false that environmental risks are small, this graph shows in turquoise established breast cancer risk factors that are listed on the National Cancer Institute website. When you see the colored dot farther to the right, that means higher risk. So the turquoise dots are the established breast cancer risk factors. The orangish dots are environmental studies. So the top three turquoise risks are alcohol use, light, moderate, and heavy. Then postmenopausal weight, using estrogen, progesterone, hormone therapy. Physical activity to the left of the dotted line lowers your breast cancer risk. Then back to the right with higher risk, never having given birth or giving birth after age 25. So those are the established breast cancer risk factors that NCI and others are communicating about all the time. And then below, the first three orange dots are that DDT study that I showed you. Then comes a set of occupational exposures to ethylene oxide, organic solvents, some other chemicals, chlorinated alkanes, toluene. And then below that, permanent hair dye in Black women in the NIH sister study, hair dye in white women, hair straighteners, and then the two examples from the Long Island study of PAHs, an air pollutant. So if you look at how far to the right these dots are, you can see that the orange dots and the blue dots are basically in the same range. And some of those orange dots are farther to the right with showing higher risk. Here's another odd example of false reassurance from the Harvard Cancer Fact Finder. This is the entry for antiperspirants in breast cancer, which they classify as false information. However, if you scroll down within their own entry, you see that they say that antiperspirants sometimes contain ingredients linked to cancer and that more research is needed. So logically, it would make more sense to use their "we're not sure" classification and to add, consistent with the Institute of Medicine report, it makes sense to choose products that don't contain fragrance or parabens, chemicals that are linked to breast cancer. So now I'm going to turn to talking about some brand new science by my team that is opening a new way of looking at chemicals that could increase breast cancer risk because they increase production of estrogen or progesterone, chemicals that are linked to breast cancer. I talked to you before about chemicals that mimic estrogen, and those are generally regarded as weaker than the body's natural estrogen. But these are chemicals that stimulate production of full-fledged natural estrogen or progesterone. And this is, again, a study consistent with the IR key characteristics of carcinogens framework. The paper was published in Environmental Health Perspectives and was named a Paper of the Year by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. It uses data from US EPA in vitro tests. And here's the concept. So these EPA tests are screening large numbers of chemicals for molecular mechanisms That is, are they biologically active in ways that are related to pathways to cancer? In this case, the test looks at the ability of the aromatase enzyme to produce estrogen. And the study design says we know about this breast cancer pathway. Now, if we see a chemical exposure that activates this molecular mechanism, then we can infer that this may be linked to breast cancer. This is a very important conceptual map because the EPA Toxicology for the 21st Century program is amassing this data from cell studies about the molecular activity of chemicals. These molecular tests are rapid and they're inexpensive, so they're practical to use quickly for the thousands of chemicals that are in use, to highlight ones that require further scrutiny. So the results produce a risk map, and the worst chemicals are going to be the ones that have high hormonal effects at low doses. But we also want to be concerned about this middle group if they are very common exposures, if their effects may be at higher doses or lower hormonal effect, but if they're very widespread exposures, those would still be of concern. So here's the risk map that resulted from the study. Don't squint. Yeah, I'm going to read you a few of the results. So here you see some pesticides, atrazine, diazinon, and malathion are going into that high risk zone on this risk map. Here's an industrial chemical, an air pollutant, DEHP, a phthalate used in food packaging, and BP3, sunscreen chemical. You can get naturally occurring things can have risk, like clove leaf oil. DMBA is used experimentally to induce mammary gland tumors in animals. So now we know that maybe the reason it does that is that it stimulates the production of estrogen. So does this mean proof that these chemicals cause breast cancer? No. On the other hand, does it mean we should give these chemicals a free pass? Also, no. So I hope very much that EPA will consider this type of data as it rebuilds its endocrine disruptor screening program. They announced last fall that they were going to regroup on their efforts to assess the endocrine effects of pesticides. And this kind of information needs to be considered in that process. So to end on a high note, breast cancer incidence can go down. We saw that when the Women's Health Initiative prompted many women to go off combination hormone replacement therapy. You can see in the graph that breast cancer incidence went down immediately after that study was published. And researchers have estimated that it resulted in 22,000 fewer breast cancer cases per year, and savings of $35 billion in the US in just the first 12 years after the study was published. So when we think about the potential for breast cancer prevention, we can see it's really quite enormous. And with that, I will thank you very much and look forward to some questions.
Thank you for a great presentation. Let's see what questions we have in the chat. First question we have is it safe to eat and drink from BPA-free plastics, or should we try to avoid plastic as much as possible?
Well, the thing is, you can't tell what's in BPA-free plastics. They could have other kinds of endocrine disruptors. So when you can, it's safer to use glass or stainless steel.
The next question we have is, what about dairy? Some functional medicine providers in particular say it's a hormone disruptor.
That's a good question and not my own personal area of expertise, but colleagues in the breast cancer research world have raised questions about the potential that milk contains hormonally active constituents, and I would consider that to be an important question for further study.
Okay. Is the Silent Spring Institute involved in getting changes introduced in the Federal Register?
Silent Spring Institute is a research organization. So our job is to produce knowledge. We do use that knowledge to inform officials, and we publish it in peer-reviewed scientific journals so everyone can see it and use it. We're trying to generate practical knowledge that advocacy organizations can take into the policy sphere to create changes. I hope that was the answer to the question.
Do environmental factors affect all cancers in the same ways, or does it depend on the type of cancer?
Well, I mean, I think yes and no. Those key characteristics of carcinogens developed by the International Agency for Research on Cancer are intended to be a general approach to understanding cancers. And different ones may be different of those characteristics may be more or less relevant to different cancers. For example, the hormone receptor activity is going to be relevant to breast, testicular, prostate, endometrial cancers, and maybe not all other cancers.
Someone asks, what about the EWG, Environmental Watch Group? They test and assign grades for many common products we use. They also look at pesticides in fruits and vegetables.
Environmental Working Group has resources that many people like to use. What's different about the ToxMe app is that it's more general. It doesn't tell you to buy a specific product. It doesn't have brand names of products. And it's not selling you anything. But Environmental Working Group is a great resource that many people like, and we would consider them an ally.
Okay, let's see. Someone asks, how can you have these conversations with medical professionals? When I asked my mom's oncologist, they couldn't answer, yet we are recommended to use petroleum-based relief creams. Do you have any advice?
Yeah, that's an issue I'm trying to address, and appreciate your help addressing it. I showed you a link to a series of 3-part forum for clinicians. The recordings are on our website. Trying to update them. Their job is to diagnose and treat disease. They're not experts on environmental prevention, and we can't really expect them to know everything. But it would be helpful if more doctors became updated about this key characteristics of carcinogens approach and had better understanding of the potential role of environmental chemicals in cancer etiology. So we're working on that. The first forum series was co-hosted with Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. The second forum last summer was hosted at Columbia Med School, and those videos are on the web too. And we hope to keep reaching out to more clinicians.
Okay, I have a few more questions. One is, are cancer risk assessment for chemicals required under Toxic Substance Control Act?
I think there's probably somebody else on this call who knows more about that than I do. The TSCA reform theoretically requires more information about chemicals. And there's been a slow process of bringing chemicals up for review. But it's still the case in the US that you can put chemicals into products without testing them first.
Okay. This is a big one. Do you know why there is a huge gap in the literature exploring breast cancer and environmental risk factors?
Well, yes, there's so many factors. I think the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences is tiny compared with the National Cancer Institute, which is more not as focused on environmental factors, although they're beginning to include environmental factors. Environmental factors have been harder to study. Medical research has been focused on treatment. Of course, treatment is important, and we want better treatments. But I do think it would be great if we rebalanced our investments to more investment in prevention.
Someone asks, how do you define environmental risk factors?
Well, the classic public health definition is everything that's not genetic, but Silent Spring Institute is focused on environmental chemicals specifically, and so that's our focus. But many public health professionals would include various lifestyle factors as part of environmental.
What are leading health agencies that produce reputable information? I was surprised to see that the National Cancer Institute produces misleading information.
The National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences has better information. And specifically, the Breast Cancer and Environment Research Program has some information intended for parents of adolescents that I think is helpful.
Okay. Someone says, I'm curious what you think of the recent reports based on the Women's Health Initiative that the concern for breast cancer from HRT is for women over 60 or who begin HRT more than 10 years after menopause.
Yeah, there's been a new round of controversy about how to interpret that study and other related studies. And again, that's not my personal area of expertise. So I'll just acknowledge that there's a lot going on there.
Okay. And someone says, do you have any comments or recommendations about essential oils? I tend to think of them as safer fragrances, but I noticed clove leaf oil on your slide.
Yeah, lavender also has tested estrogenic, so that's one I would avoid. It would be helpful if there were more testing of these kinds of ingredients as well as of the synthetic compounds.
Okay. Looks like we have a few comments here. Are there any more questions? A few more minutes. Okay, are bioidentical hormone replacement therapies safer?
I'm again gonna punt on that one. It's like not part of my expertise.
Okay. And then the last one I see here is, what are a few easy things people can do to reduce risk related to chemical exposure for breast cancer or recurrence?
I would say easy things to do are avoid fragranced products, avoid indoor use of pesticides, keep dust levels low. So vacuum with the HEPA filter, or wet wipe windowsills periodically. House dust can contain a lot of chemicals that come from air pollution or are shedding from your product. So keeping dust levels low does help reduce your own exposure. Let's see, what else? Ventilate. We've heard that a million times in the past couple of years, and that will reduce exposures. For example, if you have a gas stove, use the fan and open the windows from time to time. Those are some of my favorites.
Someone asks, what about herbal teas?
Herbal teas, again, outside my knowledge base, but I'm a consumer of herbal teas.
This question I don't completely understand. Does the German panel on essential oils do any good? Oh.
I don't know that one either.
Okay. I know I said that was all, but we still have a few coming in and we have a few minutes. So maybe we can answer one more. We can ask one more. I don't know if you went over this, but is water absorbed by skin a problem in the shower, let's say, as opposed to drinking it?
People can be exposed to chemicals through their skin. Well, when you're showering, you're inhaling a bit, and as well as having it on your skin. But that's one of the reasons that lotions and products that you apply to your skin can result in body burden of chemicals. Yes, you can get exposed by breathing the chemicals, by ingesting them in food or dust that came off your hands, or by applying them to your skin.
Well, thank you. We're going to have to stop with the questions there because of the time. But thank you, Dr. Brody, for being with us today. For those of you who are looking to get CE credit, the link for the class evaluation, and for everyone else, actually, the link for the class evaluation is on this slide right here. We found it works best to copy and paste it into the browser rather than directly clicking on it. There's also some links here for subscribing to our newsletter and our training catalog. I want to thank Dr. Brody for being here today and thank all of you for joining us. We have a few upcoming trainings as well, which you can see on this slide. And we'd love to hear from you on the evaluation. So thank you, everyone.
Oh, thank you all for being here. It was really great. And you can contact me with other questions too, and I'll try to answer them. And I hope that some of the resources in the links will be helpful as well.
And is there a way for people to contact you if they have any questions?
Yes, they could. I think probably the best way would be to use the email info@silentspring.org.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the network of the National Library of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel, or select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.